Hello, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a hodgepodge history podcast. I'm joined today by my friend Nick. My name's Will, by the way, but I'm also with Nick.
I'm doing good. It was seamless.
No editing required there. So this is episode 33. You can tell by how polished we are.
Yes.
Have you had a good day, Nick? Are you doing well?
Yeah, I've been all right. I've had an interesting week. Held a door open for David Tennant, and then he held a door open for me. So,
Well, that sounds quite nice.
yeah, that's the excitement of my life. Is
Yeah, I can't match that really. I didn't hold the door open for any Doctor Who actors, not knowingly at least. I must say, this is the first time that you provided a doctor's note for getting out of the basement.
It's all that dust in there, just bungs up the lungs.
I don't know. Maybe it's inspiring.
Yes, because that's what people look for: dank and dust when they want to be inspired.
I like to think of ourselves as kind of like a struggling artist suffering for their work.
You're going to cut your ear off then and go a bit mad.
Well, let's not go that far, but we could sit in a mouldy basement for an hour and a half, couldn't we? We are doing this remotely today. You are in the comfort of your own home, while I have
Surrounded by carpet samples.
surrounded by carpet samples. Surprisingly, good at baffling sounds. All these carpet samples, and not terribly inspiring, but you can't have everything, can you?
I mean, I've watched many Zoom backdrops
Mm.
on the news since the pandemic struck, and I think this is the best I've seen so
You think
far.
this is it? This wall of beige.
Yeah, some of it's shag.
Well,
which
there's
is
a
quite
little
nice,
bit
yeah.
of there's some sisal over here, and there's some wool, and there's some whatever that is. I don't know.
This is great audio.
Polypropylene. By the way, I'm just gearing up for our spin-off podcast, the Carpet Cast.
Who are you doing that with?
I assumed you. Don't we come as a pair? It's great though, because in the Gallimaufry, essentially you are the guy who knows stuff, and I'm the sort of idiot sidekick. We can reverse roles. Not that I know a whole lot about carpet either, but you know.
Well, that kind of scuppers that then, doesn't it?
Never mind.
Well, thankfully, you're also going to be an expert today on our very fantastic topic.
Yes, episode 33 of the Gallimaufry podcast is about the lost colony of Roanoke.
In 1587, a small colony was founded on an island off the eastern coast of what is now Dare County in North Carolina of the United States. This settlement would have been the first permanent English colony in the New World had the settlers not suddenly disappeared owing to unknown circumstances. Its mayor, John White, left for England to request resources and manpower, but didn't return for 3 years. And when he came back, the only sign of what possibly happened to them was the word Croatan and the letters Crow carved into trees within the colony's borders. Where could these people have gone? Did they get killed? Did the various tribes absorb them? Did they turn into mythical beasts called Wendigos and consume human flesh?
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know.
Yeah, so it's a real mystery, and it has been a mystery for the last, 500 years.
Do the maths.
Yeah. Let me just work this out. Many hundreds of years. It has remained a mystery, and it's popped up all over the place in popular culture.
It's strange that it's one of those things which, they get those top 10 outstanding, crazy, mysterious things that have happened. But yeah, it's one of those mysteries that has sort of captivated people for centuries. And if I'm going to be honest, spoiler alert, I have no idea why.
It's an odd one, isn't it? It's always up there with sort of the Mary Celeste. In some ways, I think the mystery has kind of distorted the facts slightly. When you look at it from a historical perspective and you look at the facts available, there's actually, it's pretty plausible. You could make a plausible argument for what actually happened, and it doesn't necessarily involve Wendigos or mysterious stones But, that does not mean that it is not an interesting story. And, an important part of the history of, I suppose, European colonialism in North America.
It was the first English settlement on the sort of northern section of America, because there were other settlements further south. The Spanish controlled loads of South America, as we know, and to the north around Newfoundland, you had fishing villages controlled by the French or other different powers as well. So it wasn't the first settlement; it was just the first English settlement, and I think that's probably why it's why it has this sense of worth attached to it, because it was also the first English colonist was born in this colony.
But Roanoke Island is an island, and it's located within a string of barrier islands off the north coast of what is now North Carolina, called the Outer Banks. They line most of the North Carolina coastline, and today they are actually something of a modern-day tourist destination. And they're known for their wide stretches of open beachfront and vibrant marine ecosystem. If you look at pictures today, there's actually a lot of quite fancy sort of beach houses and stuff located along there. The Outer Banks have been known for many, many years to the local Native American people, but it wasn't until the 16th century that they became known to Europeans. The Outer Banks were explored initially in 1524 by a guy called Giovanni Verrazzano, who mistook the large lagoon between the islands and the mainland for the Pacific Ocean, and concluded that the islands were an isthmus. Isthmus. That's a really hard.
That's right. Yeah,
it's a really hard word to say, that one. Anyway, it was one of them, and he believed that this would be a shortcut to China, and he went and presented his findings to the kings of France and England, but neither was particularly interested, and he got no response, and he went no further.
He was also wrong.
Maybe they knew something he didn't. Anyway, in 1578, Queen Elizabeth I of England granted a charter to a man called Sir Humphrey Gilbert to explore and colonise territories in North America that were not yet claimed by Christian kingdoms. Gilbert's charter was kind of vague, but he understood that it kind of gave him rights to all territory in the New World north of Spanish Florida. In 1583, Gilbert briefly claimed St. John's in modern Newfoundland as the first English territory in North America, but he was lost at sea on his return journey to England. He reminds me a bit of, we keep coming back to this, but in Blackadder II, the character played by the guy who was Doctor Who in the 80s. Do you know who I mean?
Oh, Tom Baker.
Tom Baker's character. Yeah. He made me think a bit of Tom Baker's character from Blackadder.
Oh, the one who's like, oh, you have a woman's arms.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah.
With the beard.
Okay. Yeah, possibly he was an influence, because Sir Humphrey Gilbert was obviously this pompous adventuring sailor. And as you said, he died at sea in September 1583 after many failed expeditions to the Americas. The Newfoundland thing was also another failure, really, because he turned up and everyone thought, let's just humour the English, give them some money, not let them cause trouble, and when they leave, we'll just go back to doing what we've always done. And that's essentially what happened. So he claimed it, and then it was completely forgotten about as soon as he left. But he had imparted his love of seafaring and settling the New World to his half-brother, who happened to be a very, very famous individual in the English court, and one that we remember fondly from Blackadder for another reason, and that was Sir Walter Raleigh.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Walter Raleigh, a pretty major figure during this time.
Nothing to do with the bikes, just to clarify.
Sadly, nothing to do with the bikes. Sir Walter Raleigh was an English explorer and coloniser. He was the son of Walter Raleigh, the elder, and Catherine Champernowne, and was born to a landed gentry family of Protestant faith in Devon. And he was also cousin of a chap called Sir Richard Grenville, who will pop up later in this story. But initially, Walter served as a distinguished soldier, having served during the Munster Rebellion in Ireland, and he later went on to gain the favour of Queen Elizabeth I, rising steadily through the ranks of the English court. This led to him being granted a number of monopolies and trade privileges, and eventually made him one of the wealthiest men in England.
Just to point out that his time spent in Ireland was also brutally suppressing rebels. In fact, he was responsible for the slaughter of Smerick Fort. It was a papal rebellion. Obviously the Catholics were rising up, trying to gain a foothold back in Ireland and England. And then when he left Ireland after slaughtering all these people, the reason he left was he thought the English handled the Irish too leniently.
Yeah, I mean, Walter Raleigh was a very influential man from this time, but let's not pretend that he was, a particularly nice man.
Apparently he was intelligent with a handsome and well-compacted frame, as described by someone in court.
That's just what they say about me as well.
Yes. I mean, well-compacted. It's such an odd phrase.
Well compacted, it just sounds like he's got like really long limbs and a really short torso.
It just makes me think of an impacted bowel, but that's just maybe my...
Old impacted bow Raleigh.
Yeah.
But anyway, Raleigh, as we mentioned, was a keen explorer. In 1584, he led an expedition to North America, which was the first since a previous attempt by Martin Frobisher in 1578 ended in failure, where he explored the coast of North Carolina, or what would become North Carolina, and returned to England with his findings. He would name this land Virginia in honour of Queen Elizabeth I, who was known as the Virgin Queen for her purity and, other reasons.
Holding it in for quite a bit.
This was apparently not quite as creepy as it sounds, and actually helped him to establish his position in Queen Elizabeth's court.
I'd actually argue it is as creepy as it sounds, but by the logic of the day, it was actually reverence.
He's effectively saying that Queen Elizabeth I's defining trait was the fact that she never had sex, which is probably not doing her many favours. I'm sure she had many other good traits other than that.
It's also just a bit weirder as well when you consider that she was a virgin queen, and the only reason Raleigh rose to be the court favourite because he was considered her last best suitor.
Do you think
she kind of fancied him?
I think he was trying to kind of goat her a bit, like, oh, look at the virgin over there. Wouldn't you like to do something about that?
Wouldn't you like a bit of this well compacted frame?
Oh yeah, well compacted frame. How could she say no? But anyway, old well compacted Raleigh was also a patron of the arts and sciences, and he was even said to be a friend of William Shakespeare. After Gilbert's death, Queen Elizabeth divided his charter between his brother Adrian Gilbert and his half-brother Sir Walter Raleigh, as we mentioned. Adrian got the patent on Newfoundland and all the points north, where geographers expected to find the Northwest Passage to Asia, while Raleigh got whichever lands lay to the south and had not already been claimed by Spain. Raleigh's charter specified that he needed to establish a colony by 1591, or he would lose his right to colonisation. Fortunately, Raleigh was aware of Verrazano's previous account of the Outer Banks and its potential as a gateway to China, which seemed as good a place as any to start his colonisation plans. Being something of a high flyer in the royal court, he was, however, also forbidden from leaving the Queen's side, making this whole colonisation lark a bit tricky. Nevertheless, Raleigh delegated the missions to a number of his associates and oversaw operations from London.
This desire to colonise came at a background time of when England was the last real remaining Protestant stronghold in Europe. You had Philip II with his massive Catholic empire from Spain, eyeing up England's white cliffs, licking his lips.
Virgin England.
So the idea of settling a colony in North America was not simply just obviously to settle it and claim it, and it was to get the resources from it. It was a place to establish a base to harass Spanish shipping in the south, because every day Spanish ships would sail from South America to Europe carrying loads of treasures and valuable goods that English privateers would love to rob and steal. In fact, Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, many of England's most famous sort of sailors were actually privateers who were essentially just licensed pirates. 1584, he had this royal charter to colonise North America. He sent his first expedition to explore the eastern coast of North America in April. The captains in charge were two blokes called Philip Amadis and Arthur Barlow. Amadis commanded the very stout ship called the Dorothy, which was owned by Sir Walter Raleigh himself. And then a smaller pinnace commanded by Barlow. And a pinnace is basically a sort of very small light boat propelled by oars and sails, which allows you to sort of navigate or inland passages with ease, whereas something like the Dorothy was a much bigger ship, which you couldn't do that as easily. So they dropped anchor a mile from the island of Hatteras, which was made up of a bunch of really nice-looking trees, apparently, according to the chroniclers on the ship. So you had red cedars, pines, cypress trees. There were rabbits and deers everywhere. It was a lush wilderness, a paradise even.
Nice.
And they determined that three major peoples inhabited the area around. The Sakatans, whose chief was called Wingina, the Croatoans, the Wepmiocs, and the Chaunocs. And they were all Algonquian-speaking people that had lived there for thousands of years. And they all basically had this very relatively loose society. There wasn't really a caste system. You had your big hitters, like your priests and the chief, of course, and your important warriors. But really, high status depended on the ruler rather than anything else. And most people were pretty much on the same level. But like the Europeans, religion was fundamental to the society. They had lots of rituals and ceremonies. They had in all their villages, they had public spaces for religious events. Again, very much like Europe. The English, however, arrived at a time of severe drought, and there was war between a number of the tribes. It took 3 days for them to get in contact with each other. Surprisingly, by all reports, it was actually quite peaceful. So they met 3 natives who approached them, and they exchanged, trinkets and clothes with them. And this led to, a day later, them basically meeting the acting chief of the Secretans. So Wingina, who was the actual chief, was wounded in a battle, and he was unable to meet them. So he sent his brother Granjanimo, and he agreed to them with 40 and 50 of his country people, and it was all very nice and amicable. By August, both captains had gathered enough knowledge to return home. They had the location, they had the knowledge of the natives, who had explained how they could live and survive on the island, and they also took with them 2 natives to return to England to promote the expedition even further. One of them was called Manteo, who was the son of the Croatan's chief, and Juan Chez, who was a Sakatan, who both would return with wildly differing views of the English eventually.
So the first expedition was something of a success. They came back, and Raleigh was actually knighted as Knight, Lord and Governor of Virginia, which must have been quite nice for him. So encouraged by this, Raleigh planned another expedition where he would hopefully establish a colony to be governed by Ralph Lane, with Philip Amadis serving as admiral again. The overall operation would be led by a fleet commander, a man called Sir Richard Grenville. The intended number of colonists was 69, but in the end, 600 men were sent in the voyage, half of whom were to remain in the colony. Of the men were a number of civilian attendants, including a metallurgist called Joachim Gans, a scientist called Thomas Harriot, and an artist called John White. The 2 Native Americans who'd been brought back on the previous expedition, Manteo and Juan Chez, would also be returned from England on the voyage. The fleet consisted of 7 ships, including the galleon Tiger, the flyboat Roebuck, and other ships called Red Lion, Elizabeth, Dorothy, and 2 small pinnaces. The fleet departed Plymouth on the 9th of April 1585 and eventually made landfall on the 26th of June.
Just to add to that, so the Tiger was actually Elizabeth's own ship. She was partially invested in the expedition because of, obviously, her infatuation with Raleigh. So he had also used Spanish concerns coupled with the information brought back by Barlow and Amadis to raise more funds to fund this expedition. And as you said, it was all men.
Yeah.
So if he was trying to establish a colony, he wasn't doing it in the right way. Almost half were soldiers, and as you said, the rest were sort of artisans to sort of help build a sort of base, which essentially would act as a launching pad to attack Spanish shipping. That was the main goal of this. The voyage had a bad start from the beginning, with the Tiger ended up being completely separated and travelling alone through a fierce storm. So they lost 1 pinnace, and the rest of the ship scattered. And they kind of eventually made their way, as you said, to land at the place they'd chosen, pillaging some Spanish loot along the way to ensure that they kept up supplies.
We mentioned the fleet commander was a man called Sir Richard Grenville, who is kind of an interesting man in himself. Grenville was an English privateer and explorer. He was the son of Sir Roger Grenville, who was actually the captain of the Mary Rose when she sank in Portsmouth Harbour.
It's a good omen.
Yeah, it's going. I mean, we're kind of moving away from Blackadder and moving more into Uncle Albert at this point, I think. But anyway, his family were the lords of the manors of Bideford in Devon and Stowe in Kilkhampton in Cornwall. He was also a cousin of Sir Walter Raleigh, and also of the privateer and explorer Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who we mentioned earlier. After a brief stint studying law, during which he was outlawed for 3 months after stabbing a man and leaving him to die, Grenville decided to pursue a military career. It probably seemed like the natural course for him.
Yeah, well, it makes sense if you want to kill someone.
Yeah, seems ideal.
Without an escape punishment.
Yeah. I mean, why not? If you can do it without any kind of the ramifications. So he saw action in Hungary, fighting the Turks on behalf of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as a fair amount of unpleasant business in Ireland, before returning to England, whereupon he decided to try his hand at privateering. And this is what essentially leads to him being assigned as the fleet commander of this second expedition.
And he, by all accounts, he wasn't a particularly nice chap to get along with. He was quite arrogant and had an inflated sense of ego, which might explain why he tried to stab someone.
Yeah.
Which obviously didn't really lend itself to great relationships with the natives. So there were tensions between this new group of heavily armoured men and the natives pretty much from the off. And unfortunately started by what seems to be an accidental theft or some sort of confusion. There was basically they got into a barney over a silver cup. Initially, the natives welcomed them, but then they were sort of angry that the English were sort of exploiting the land and the resources, demanding food off the natives. But there was this weird dispute over a silver cup where it got taken by one of the natives, which led to the English aggressively sacking a town, which further did not endear them to the natives.
It's an odd thing to do when you're... I mean, they must have felt quite vulnerable, these men on this island in a foreign land surrounded by natives. You'd have thought they'd be on best behaviour, but no, they decided to go and burn down a village.
They ended up building a fort on the island of Roanoke. It was relatively lightly defended, to be fair, because they did still have friendly relations with the surrounding tribes to a degree. But they did build armaments nearby, out of fear that actually the Spanish would attack them more than the natives. A few decades earlier, the French Huguenot fort built in Florida called Fort Caroline, which had been completely wiped off the map by the Spanish after they discovered it. Partly because they didn't want the French incurring on their land, and also partly because they were heretical Protestants. So they did build some defences. But what then happened was Grenville, who was just a bit bored of all this, wanted to return to England. He thought he had gathered enough information, he thought he had done enough to establish a base head, and left in August, and left his junior Ralph Lane in charge with 100 men. So he returned home with news of the Roanoke River, which he argued could be used to move smaller boats inland, and there was the possibility they'd learned from the natives that there was gold and silver in the hills in the interior. He'd also returned with a haul of Spanish goodies that he talk about serendipity, that he captured along the way in the form of the Santa Maria ship, which was valued when it returned to England at £300,000.
Right.
So, it's quite a nice gift to bring back.
I think it's also worth mentioning, we mentioned earlier about a man called John White who was part of this expedition. And he's interesting and he's kind of important to this story. During his time on the expedition, he would make watercolours of the surrounding people and sort of natural features and stuff, which are some of the few remaining records we have of pre-colonial North American people and culture.
Yeah, both him and Harriet actually were very friendly with the natives, and as you said, they took lots of drawings that would actually help end up funding the third expedition, the final expedition, to entice people to get there.
Yeah, I mean, White, he was also a cartographer, and a lot of the maps from this time of this part of the world are produced by White. It's actually quite rare at the time that White was an enthusiastic user of watercolours, as most contemporary painters preferred oil paints at the time. But we're not really sure where or how White was trained as an artist. We can sort of see he's part of colonial expeditions, exploring, obviously cartography.
No, his origins and ultimately his actual end is a bit sketchy because he wasn't as giant a figure as someone like Raleigh. So there's little record of how his beginnings and his ends. But returning to the exhibition, so once Grenville had left and Lane was left in charge, things got even worse. The relief fleet that had actually originally been sent got diverted to annoy Spanish ships further north. They were now entirely dependent on the natives for food. But unfortunately, not only had they brought trinkets and clothes and the promise of Christianity, they had also brought massive disease which was ripping through the natives' community. Remember we talked about Manteo and Wanches who went to England. So when they both returned, both had very different views of the English. Manteo was very positive about them. He said they were great people. They would be nothing but friends. Whereas Wanches, his view was like, they're reckless and they're dangerous. And they are strange. Don't trust them.
He probably wasn't wrong.
He wasn't wrong because the disease was kind of proof of how reckless and dangerous they could be, as well as the the incident over the Silver Cup and the sacking of the town. So all this evidence was starting to build up in the minds of certain leaders around the area. But remember Wingina?
Yes.
He decided to take action to stop his people dying from disease and to stop the English levying food off him. He changed his name to Pemizapan, which means he who watches, and devised a plan to basically trick the English and hopefully wipe them out, but not by his own hand.
Yeah.
He convinced them they were about to be attacked by the Chomanoks, and he told them that there was a summit of chieftains in their capital city, between them and other tribes who were going to come up with a plan to attack the English. So he told them the location and said, go and stop them, otherwise they'll kill you. So the English travelled to the city, ambushed it, took it over with ease. The natives offered no resistance there because they were like, what the hell's going on?
Right.
So they easily captured the chief of the tribe, Menatonan,
Yeah.
who basically said, what you doing, mate? You got this all wrong. It was actually your friend who wants to wipe you out. So Lane was like, who do I believe? The person that has helped me and given me food, or this random guy? In the end, he made up his mind that actually he was being betrayed. By June of 1586, he had decided he'd had enough and organised a surprise attack on the treacherous chief, who was gathering support, ironically, from other chiefs as well to attack the English. He was killed in the ensuing battle. He was shot and then apparently miraculously jumped up and ran off into a forest, where he was then chased after and beheaded.
Right.
And this would forever transform the relationships between Sekatans, of which he was the chief, and the English forever.
Yeah, I can't imagine that went down particularly well.
It didn't go down well, no. They were still stuck in a strange land without any means to get home, really. But luck would have it, who would arrive soon?
Oh, is that a question?
It's a question, yes.
It would be the fleet of Sir Francis Drake.
Yeah! And why was he there?
He was in the area.
Who are you going to call? Sir Francis Drake.
Francis
yes.
Drake.
He had just been on a massive expedition which was aimed at plundering all the Spanish riches to the south, including places like Panama. In fact, he set off with the largest plundering fleet to date of 25 massive ships in September 1585. However, they had found their pickings quite slim. And they had been ordered to reinforce Roanoke. But finding the situation dire, he decided to instead evacuate Lane and his men, leaving only a skeleton crew of 15 in the fort. Drake was heralded a hero for his actions attacking the Spanish, but his expedition was ultimately a net loss. They didn't gain nearly enough for the cost of sending it. Lane returned to Raleigh's condemnation for abandoning the colony. However, as mentioned earlier, they did gain information around the natives that suggested that in the interior was a wealth of metals, including gold, providing Raleigh with an impetus to keep trying to establish a colony. However, it was probably a sort of mistranslation because there was actually a lot of copper in the hills, and I think there was a misunderstanding that a lot of the English thought that gold could be there as well.
I don't know if this was on the same expedition, but I know Sir Francis Drake spent a great deal of time trying to find El Dorado, the city of gold. I'm thinking of. Do you ever play the Uncharted games?
I haven't, no, actually.
Effectively, the main character is meant to be a descendant of Francis Drake, and they talk about El Dorado a lot. This is why I shouldn't be using PlayStation games as historical references. They also, just on a side note, they also brought back tobacco, maize, and potatoes to England on their trip home as well, and helped to popularise them. So despite the previous expedition being a bit of a disaster, Raleigh was, however, persuaded to make another attempt to colonise Roanoke Island. After the brief fracas between the previous colonists and the Native Americans, however, the island was deemed not to be a terribly safe place for English settlers. It was therefore suggested that the new colony be established at Chesapeake Bay, partially due to a belief that the Pacific coast could potentially lay just beyond the explored areas and therefore a shortcut to East Asia. On the 7th of January in 1587, Raleigh approved a corporate charter to found a new city with John White as governor, alongside 12 assistants. Would you like to take a guess at what Raleigh proposed his new city be called?
It's not going to be Virgin City.
I'll give you a clue. He really liked mountain bikes.
Was it Raleigh City?
It was Raleigh. So
How modest.
being the face of potatoes wasn't enough for him. He had to be a city as well. Approximately 115 people agreed to join the colony. That included White's pregnant daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. The fleet departed on the 8th of May and, after a relatively uneventful voyage, anchored at Croatoan Island.
It was made up mostly of sort of rising middling classes, good tradespeople that depended on the ebb and flow of the river around London. So you've got fisher people, millers, sail makers, people with practical good skills. And as you said, there were 12 assistants, 3 of which would actually stay in England to lobby and represent the colony. All the assistants could be argued came from what we would call good stock.
Right.
And were well connected with merchants in London. And they were all elevated to gentry status by Raleigh. And White was actually given a coat of arms. So it's sort of an attempt to build up a minor aristocracy across the pond.
Is this partially, do you think, to encourage them to go? 'Cause it sounds like if you're a well-established merchant in England, you would probably need some encouragement to go to this kind of desolate island on the other side of the world.
Well, it wasn't desolate.
I mean, no, not desolate. That's probably the wrong word for it.
It was actually very, very familiar.
Okay.
In terms of its site. At least according to the writings, which could have easily been like making it up to make it seem more appealing. But yeah, so during the winter of 1586 to 1587, they had gathered around about 92 men, 17 women and 9 kids, as well as their pilot, Simon Fernandez, a rough and ready sailor. They also had a couple of natives with them, including Manteo, who had travelled back on the other expedition as well. The majority of them were very young, actually. They're all in their sort of mid-20s.
So it must have been a bit like an 18 to 30s holiday, but 16th century style.
So only John White, Fernandez, and a couple of others were over 40. So they were the adults trying to keep control. There were 11 couples, and most of them came from London, particularly from Stepney, where Ananias and Eleanor, his daughter, lived. So obviously they used their family connections to get people to come with them, and people that they just knew. There aren't really many records of why people chose to go, what their motivations were. As you mentioned, you're travelling halfway across the world. But I think it was just the family and friends connection. It was like, well, we're going.
Yeah.
Why don't you come with us? Oh, all right then.
There's probably the excitement of going somewhere new and relatively uncharted and opportunities, I suppose, and being, kind of, I don't know, on the forefront of it.
Exactly, yeah. But at least a third of the settlers were related to one another.
Yeah.
Which doesn't do much for the gene pool.
No, that seems a bit short-sighted.
But there's also an argument that there were quite a few Puritans on board who were seeking an even purer form of Protestantism than could be found in England. They didn't think we'd gone hard enough on the Catholics, so they wanted an even purer form.
Bound to pick up a few nutters, though, aren't you, on something like this?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Look at the people who paid to go up into space.
Nutters. Yeah, rich nutters.
Yeah.
The flagship, the Line, would carry the bulk of the travellers. There was a huge flyboat which would carry another bulk of the travellers and all the cargo, with a smaller pinnace following. So in total, there were supposed to be 150 crew members, but come the day, in April, when they were due to leave, so it's April 1587, around 2 dozen were thought to have backed out. They were like, oh, actually, mate, I'm going to stay here.
Right, they heard about the Silver Cup debacle, did they?
Possibly, yeah. So they then sailed to Plymouth, and on the 8th of May, they finally set off from England's shores, never to see them again, unless they were John White, who did. And actually Fernandez, but we'll come to that a bit later. The journey was incredibly rough. The boats got separated. The flyboat got completely lost from the others, and that was a bit worrying because it had all the supplies on. Life on board ship was hard. It was cramped conditions. It was dangerous, and they had small children on board as well. So every time they got a place to land, it was like treated as as like a massive holiday. But every time they did land, they also ran into trouble. So, for instance, when they came to the Virgin Islands in June, they tried to eat the fruit, got poisoned by it, got sick from the stagnant water. And apparently on the flyboat, which had docked in Puerto Rico, 2 Catholics on the voyage had deserted raising fears that they would inform the Spanish.
That's one saw on TripAdvisor there, isn't it?
Around this time, White and Fernandez kept coming into conflict with each other because Fernandez was like, why do we keep stopping? Let's just get there. Eager to get to pillaging Spanish ships because the Lion was actually well fitted out with nice cannons. Careless, actually, in his haste because he almost wrecked the ships twice after mistaking the latitude of some reefs. Anyway, by the 22nd of July, they had finally reached not Chesapeake Bay, which was their intended location. They'd actually ended up in Roanoke. And there's conflicting stories about why they ended up there. White, on his return to England, said Fernandez had mutinied, told his crew to drop everyone off except White and take White back with him to England, which doesn't really make much sense. What probably happened was White said, let's stop here for a bit. There's a fort there. We can rest up and then we can move on to Chesapeake Bay because we haven't got our flyboat. We haven't got our supplies. What are we going to do? So they rocked up to Roanoke, only to find that the garrison was deserted. So they began work to repair it. And then eventually on the 25th, the missing flyboat arrived.
Yeah.
Completely fine. The only two losses had been the deserters. And so this is where, it gets a bit complicated because obviously they don't end up going to Chesapeake Bay at all. So presumably they would stay here, rest up, rebuild, and then move on to the bay. During this time, John White wanted to re-establish good relations with the natives because he was on good terms before. So he tried to strike up relationships with the Croatans, and Manteo was integral to this as well. But a lot of the tribes refused to meet. And there was a very unfortunate incident with a settler named George Howe, which further complicated things.
Shortly after the colonists had disembarked, one colonist, a man by the name of George Howe, goes out searching for crabs and is killed by a native. It's suggested that this was probably a Sekatan, though it's not entirely clear. But either way, it probably didn't help things much. So they're off to a bad start. So in an effort to try to re-establish relations with the Croatan, White sends Stafford to travel to Croatoan along with Manteo, where they learn how a coalition of mainland tribes, led by Wanchese, had attacked the men on Roanoke. Despite their attempts, they were unable to negotiate a truce with the tribes, and this led to White staging a preemptive strike on a mainland town. The locals, however, fearing retribution for killing George Howe, had already left, resulting in the English mistakenly attacking the Croatan instead. Fortunately, Manteo was able to smooth things over to some extent, however.
He was actually would go on to have a bit more success. He was given the title Lord of the Roanoke on August the 13th, admitted to the Church of England for his service. What a great honour, I guess.
I bet the other Native Americans really respected him for that.
Part of Roanoke is actually named after him, I think the northern tip.
So shortly after Manteo's ascension, on the 18th of August, Eleanor Dare, the daughter of John White, gave birth to a girl called Virginia. And she is allegedly the first Christian born in North America. Or at least that's what they said at the time.
But as we've said, she's definitely the first English colonist born in America.
Let's go with English colonist. That seems like it's hard to get that one wrong. Later, on the 27th of August, 1587, White left the colony along with the fleet and returned to England. He had allegedly been quite reluctant to leave, but was persuaded by the colonists to report back about their situation and to request help. The colonists also mentioned that they intended to relocate 50 miles inland. At least that's what White said at the time.
Just a bit more context around why White left is that by August 21st, a few days after his granddaughter was born, the ships were preparing to return for supplies, but a storm cut the flyboat off from the Lion, which then just disappeared, and someone had to return for more aid, which is the reason why White... He was cajoled into going, actually, at least according to his notes. All the setters said, no, you have to go, you're the most experienced, you're the one they'll listen to. He wanted to stay, apparently. He then left on the 27th, which was also coincidentally when the Lion turned up again.
Right.
So they both of them sailed to the Azores, where they parted ways. Fernandez decided to go and pillage, and the flyboat returned to England. So he landed in Ireland in October, and then finally got to England on the 8th of November.
White returns to England in November of 1587, and when he arrives, there are reports in England that the Spanish Armada has begun mobilising for an attack. In response to these reports, Queen Elizabeth then banned any ship from leaving England so that they could all be available to participate in a potential battle. This was bad news for English shipping, but probably worse news for the desperate colonists on Roanoke. So over the winter, White was then allowed to join Grenville on an expedition to attack the Spanish in the Caribbean. However, the fleet is delayed by bad weather and is then ordered to stay and defend England. Arguing that 2 of the ships were unsuitable for combat, White was permitted to then take them to Roanoke. While the ships finally departed for Roanoke on the 22nd of April, their captains, in an attempt to increase their profits, tried to capture Spanish ships on the way and ended up being attacked by French pirates near Morocco. Nearly 24 crew members are killed, and the supplies for Roanoke were looted, forcing the ships to then return to England. In the August, the Spanish Armada has finally been defeated. However, England decides to maintain its ban of ships leaving the country in order to prepare for a potential counterattack against Spain in 1589. Despite his efforts, White would not be permitted to make another resupply attempt until 1590, which is about 3 years after he last left Roanoke.
He actually he'd end up returning on August the 18th, 1590, his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, coincidentally.
Which would have been a very nice birthday present.
Yeah, it would have been if they'd met. But yeah, as you said, he really struggled to find passage because no one was interested. No one wanted to fund it. No one wanted to, like, even Raleigh had lost interest because obviously the Spanish attack was taking precedence. So yeah, he finally found a group he could travel with, group heading towards the Americas, who were trying to circumvent the ban. And the way that that ships could get around travelling sort of outwards was if they were going to a colony or if they were going to sort of conduct trade somewhere else. Abraham Cock was the captain of the Hopewell, and he was the man ultimately responsible for ferrying John White back. And initially they didn't get on, but they actually became sort of quite good friends. Yeah. And Cock actually went out of his way to sort of try and help White get to these people as best he could, despite losses of crew along the way due to disease or just bad luck and things like that. On August the 16th, the ship actually arrived at the sort of inlet past the territory of the Croatans. And as the ship navigated towards Roanoke, they kept seeing these spirals of smoke from the mainland, which they sort of shrugged off and thought, oh, what's that? It's just smoke. But when they got there, they found it completely and utterly deserted. Like, no one was there. There was no sign of struggle. There was no sign of battle or any foul play.
The crew came ashore on Roanoke and find the settlement to be completely deserted. So they decide to investigate a bit. So White's party find fresh tracks in the sand, but no sign of who might have left them. They also discover the letters CRO carved into a tree. Nevertheless, they decide to proceed towards the site of the colony. White noted that fortifications seem to have been built, as well as the now infamous inscription on a fence post near the entrance, Croatoan. This inscription has become kind of notorious in the whole kind of mystery surrounding Roanoke. This people try and interpret what this means. I think
it's quite obvious what it means. I mean, White assumed with all these clues that they had moved to Croatoan Island.
Yeah,
but he was unable to get there. So Cock was prepared to take him, but bad weather prevented this and his men from actually going to search inland. The men wouldn't go with them. They wanted to get back to what they wanted to originally do, is why they left. And in the end, Cock's ship joined up with John Hawkins, as we mentioned earlier, a famous privateer, in Trinidad to raid ships. But this then sort of fell apart quite quickly and ended up going back to England, which White was forced to return with them because he couldn't just be left there on his own. He would no chance of getting inland without help.
Just tragic, really, because when you consider he left his daughter and his granddaughter on the island, and obviously he went back to England hoping to find help, and really he was seeing them for the last time. He'd never see them again.
And when he got back, Raleigh had seemingly lost interest, mainly because he had secretly married one of the Queen's maid of honours, who then found out and got very angry about this.
Raleigh had disgraced himself. I think he ends up going into the Tower of London for doing it, doesn't he? He
does. He gets put in there for a while, but then she sort of ultimately forgives him. and then banishes him to live in Devon for a bit.
Worse things could happen. I wouldn't mind being banished to Devon.
It's no Cornwall.
For Raleigh, it's not quite the end, because in 1602 he sends another expedition to Roanoke, but this time it was more focused on harvesting sassafras rather than finding the colonists. And the expedition was unsuccessful anyway, so that went nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, that one in 1602 only reached Virginia. And as you said, a sort of storm sort of forces them back. And plus, yeah, he was more preoccupied with sort of finding El Dorado and raiding Spanish cities.
Yeah.
But another one was sent in 1603 called a fact-finding mission. That was led by Bartholomew Gilbert. And that also ended in disaster.
Yeah.
Another storm blew them off course. And the team that did manage to make it ashore were killed quite quickly by natives. So the crew were just like, nope, let's go back.
Yeah.
We're not staying here.
I think at this point they kind of get the point that trying to establish a colony on Roanoke really wasn't working for them. They do establish the town of Jamestown, which is still a town in Virginia, in 1607.
And that was based off the attempt to actually establish a colony at Chesapeake Bay, which is where the original colonists, the colonists were originally intended to be anyway. But yeah, there was 105 settlers, and that was led by a captain called John Smith.
There's a whole lot of John Smiths involved with American history, I think. But interestingly, this John Smith allegedly heard rumours from the local Native Americans about a place called Okanahonon, where men wore European-style clothing. Smith also sent expeditions to investigate, but they were unable to find any sign of what had happened or any kind of colonists or anything.
Yeah, I mean, over the years there have been many theories put forth to try and explain what happened to the colonists, or just try to get to the bottom of it, really. I mean, they range from the absolute madness of, aliens abducted them, they turned into monsters, to just the simple ones, yeah, they just joined the tribes or they got murdered.
If you're looking at it realistically, what is actually plausible, it comes down to either the colonists were all slaughtered or the colonists dispersed into the surrounding areas, possibly joining other tribes. Or there's another one that suggests that because all the boats were missing, the colonists attempted to sail back to England, but that probably seems a bit far-fetched. They'd have to be pretty desperate to try that.
Yeah, that was something which we only lightly touched upon, was the fact that one of the pinnaces was left with the colonists to sort of ferry them if they needed to get back and forth between Roanoke and the interior, because as some did leave for the interior and some stayed on the island and were only told to leave the island if it became too crazy or they got attacked. So everything that they had with them, like the buildings they constructed alongside the fort and various different tools, they even had armaments, they were nowhere to be found. So they must have taken them all at some point inland. And some of these artifacts, as we'll get to, have been discovered in places.
The theory that they simply assimilated into tribes, that seems to be backed up by sightings of Native Americans who have, blonde hair or grey eyes and things.
There is a story from a Londoner called John Lawson who spent time living in North Carolina in the 1700s. And he worked as a surveyor, so he went around all the areas, drawing maps, collecting information. And he wrote of one story of a group of natives that lived near Roanoke who claimed English ancestry. They could speak English. They had blue eyes. Some of them had grey eyes. And they told him stories of the first colonists and this sort of weird, depressing ghost story about a ship named Raleigh,
right,
who would ply the waters to tease them of home. So there's very strong evidence that they at least some of them settled and found life.
I mean, often the most simple explanations are the most likely. And to me, the most simple are either they all got slaughtered or they all just joined the tribes.
Yeah, or equally, they could have also have been wiped out by disease, because it goes both ways. There were nasty things lurking in America as well. Yeah. But then there's this whole story around something called dare stones, which I don't know if you read about.
Yeah, this gets a little bit kind of... This is the stone that is allegedly been inscribed by Eleanor Dare. And then were then discovered on the island.
A lot of people dispute their authenticity. Some say that one stone is real, some say that all of them are fake. But yeah, they were discovered in sort of the 30s and 40s, supposedly telling the story of what happened to the colonists. They're called Dare stones because they were written by Eleanor Dare.
Yeah.
So, but they're well done because the inscriptions are consistent with phrasing of the time, and the colonists would have had the tools to create them.
If it were a hoax, it would be a pretty weird hoax, because I mean there hadn't been a whole lot of interest in Roanoke until I think it's the late 19th century, early 20th century. You get this resurgence in it, and suddenly people are interested, and there's this, some of these kind of theories and mysteries form.
Yeah, there's disputes around it because most people say they're all hoaxes. Some people say that the first stone's real, the others are all fake, because there's quite a number of, I think it's 47 more stones were found.
Yeah.
And on the original stone found, it's actually also said that only 7 of the colonists were left alive and the rest were murdered. So it's, I mean, I find it more plausible that Manteo took in quite a lot with his tribe. And then maybe a few others got murdered. That
feels like, with Manteo, they probably would have had a good opportunity to ingratiate themselves with the tribe. It definitely seems plausible. I mean, people love a good mystery.
Yeah, I mean, there was one archaeologist, I think in recent memory, who ended up digging loads of artifacts up on Hatteras Island, which is where the Croatans lived as well. So either they did get assimilated or they got robbed and all the stuff was taken back to the Croatans. But given they had good relations, it doesn't make sense that they would murder them for their goods.
No, but the whole mystery and the story of Roanoke has been quite a benefit for the present day Roanoke. It's an inhabited island. It's part of North Carolina. There's towns there. There's like a nature park or something. But the story of the Roanoke colony is a big part of their town's story, and I think there's a play that they do, and it's sort of been running for years about the colony. So for their tourist industry, it's been quite a useful thing, I suppose.
Yeah, quite a boon. As to regards to John White and Raleigh, though, the other two key players, we don't actually know what happened to White. There's reports he died in 1603. But he kind of disappears from life. He lived on Raleigh's estate for a bit.
Yeah.
But there's not much else known. And then, of course, Raleigh himself doesn't really have the most pleasant end.
He was in high favour of Queen Elizabeth, but after marrying one of her ladies without her permission, he falls from grace slightly. He's forgiven in some ways and brought back in. But then after Elizabeth dies, she's succeeded by King James I, or King James VI of Scotland, who isn't quite so keen on him. He puts him on trial for treason, and he's imprisoned for 13 years. During this time, Raleigh actually writes a number of books and treatises, including one which would become famous called The History of the World. In 1616, Raleigh's released from prison, and he's allowed to lead an expedition to Guyana in South America in search of El Dorado. The expedition, however, was a failure, and led to Raleigh being accused of attacking a Spanish settlement, and he is then executed in 1618.
Anyway, that's Roanoke, the not so mysterious but quite interesting story of how a doomed colony of people vanished.
Yeah, personally, I think when you strip away the mystery and the pseudoscience and that sort of thing, there's actually quite an interesting story there. There's a lot of interesting characters and people who would go on to be, prominent in the kind of their own stories as well. Now, I believe it's time for your favourite part of the episode, Nick. Do you know which part that is?
We get to go home.
We don't get to go home, no. You're already home. But you got to keep that camera rolling.
I could just turn this button off.
No, you got to keep it going because it's time for the quiz. You've been getting a bit cocky these last few episodes. So I thought I would test you. But are you ready for this? Boom, 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 boom.
Excellent.
That's a good theme tune, isn't it? Right, question number 1. I'm going to start off relatively easy, okay? Just to soften you up a bit. It's fine.
Why don't I believe you?
Which of these video games features a reference to the lost colony of Roanoke? Is it A, Tomb Raider, B, Uncharted, or C, Barbie Horse Adventure?
Oh, you did mention Uncharted earlier. I've not played any of these. I've not even played Tomb Raider, to be fair.
Have you not
It's a
played
classic.
Barbie Horse Adventure?
I've not, no, sorry. There wouldn't be a random reference in there, would there? It's one of those teasing trick questions. I'm going to play it safe and go Uncharted.
No, the correct answer was Tomb Raider. It's in one of the later HD games. We see a shot of a map with the word Croatoan drawn across it.
Okay. See, I've not played Tomb Raider. But,
No.
yeah.
Never mind. There's 4 more questions to go. So, question number 2. The colony was established in July of 1587. What other important event took place that year? Was it A, Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded? Was it B, the Globe Theatre in London was completed? Or was it C, the first known written record of the word budgerigar?
I think it's Mary Queen of Scots.
Mary was the monarch of Scotland from 1542 to 1567 before being beheaded in front of 300 witnesses at Fotheringhay Castle.
Because she was implicated in a sort of plot, not of her own doing, sadly. It was a group of Catholics wanted to depose Elizabeth and put her on the throne. And it was part of the reason which led to the sort of rapid Spanish attack on England the following year.
Yeah, it all got a bit messy. But if you were interested, the Globe was completed in 1599. And the origins of the word budgerigar are unclear, but it was first recorded in 1805.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So you learn something every day, don't you?
Hopefully there's not a lot more to learn today.
There's a lot more. There's 3 more questions. Question number 3. The mystery surrounding the lost Roanoke colony was the inspiration for a group of detectives in the DC universe called the Croatoans, named for the infamous word carved into a tree following the colonists' disappearance. The members of the Croatoans includes Edogawa Sangaku, Terry 13, Tim Trench, and the Elongated Man. But who was the 5th member? Was it A, Bouncing Boy? Was it B, Dog Welder? Or was it C, Detective Chimp?
So it was Bouncing Boy, it was Dog Welder, and Detective Chimp.
Yeah.
Bouncing Boy.
Bouncing Boy. You idiot. It was Detective Chimp. It was Detective Chimp. He was a chain-smoking circus chimpanzee who gained superhuman intelligence after being brought to the Fountain of Youth by Rex the Wonder Dog. I had a look at you. Detective Chimp comes up in quite a few lists of the worst DC characters of all time. So
I can see why.
Yeah,
I can hear why.
It's a pretty flimsy story, isn't it? I never found out who Rex the Wonder Dog was. Question number 4. You're nearly there. We mentioned Walter Raleigh's fall from favour in the eyes of Queen Elizabeth I, and especially her successor James I and VI. But which other historical figure took a dim view of the man? Was it A, Winston Churchill? Was it B, Noel Edmonds? Or was it C, John Lennon? That's a pretty broad spread of
it's an incredibly broad
historical figures, isn't it?
It's quite a good quiz. I generally have been stumped on most of these answers. For some reason I am drawn to Churchill because there is something in the back of my mind. But you know what? I'm gonna go Churchill.
Churchill. He was a very opinionated man. Sadly, he wasn't the correct answer, though. What would you do if it was Edmonds?
I'd be very angry.
You're okay then. It was John Lennon.
Yeah, he was my second. I just couldn't remember.
Yeah, John Lennon, not a huge fan of tobacco, took exception to Raleigh's involvement in the introduction of smoking to England. In the song I'm So Tired on the Beatles' White Album, Lennon wrote, "Although I'm so tired, I'll have another cigarette and curse Sir Walter Raleigh, he was such a stupid git." Never mind, you can make it up on this one. Question number 5. Are you ready for this?
As ever.
Believe it or not, Roanoke Island still exists. Today it forms part of Dare County in North Carolina and consists of a couple of towns and a festival park. Which famous American actor was born on Roanoke Island in 1926? Was it A, Andy Griffith? Was it B, Jerry Lewis? Or was it C, Leslie Nielsen?
I don't know where Jerry Lewis was born. I thought Jerry Lewis was born in New York. I'm going to go Andy Griffith.
Griffith gained prominence in the starring role in a number of successful films in the 1950s before he became better known for his television roles, playing the lead roles of Andy Taylor in the sitcom The Andy Griffith Show and Ben Matlock in the legal drama Matlock. I have never seen Matlock, I only know it from The Simpsons.
Me too.
But as an interesting side note, all of those options were also born in 1926. As was David Attenborough, Mel Brooks, and Marilyn Monroe. It's weird though, isn't it? I mean, thinking that Andy Griffith, Mel Brooks, Marilyn Monroe, and Andy Griffith all born in the same year.
Well, so is the Queen.
Was she born in 26 as well?
You could have had the Queen in there.
That would have been.
Yeah, she's the same age as David Attenborough, or she was the same age as Attenborough.
Oh, would have been too easy, wouldn't it? I think you did quite well there. What did you get? 3 out of 5?
I think I only got 2.
2 out of 5. That's not bad. That's almost half.
Now that's equaled your best.
Equaled my best.
I learnt things I wanted to, and I learnt things I didn't want to.
You learnt. What didn't you want to learn?
Quite a bit of it actually. But it's good.
Good. Now you know who Detective Chimp is.
And hopefully well, maybe not that bit, but hopefully everyone else learned something too.
I think that's it then, isn't it? We're all done here.
Yep, time to go and watch Detective Chimp.
I think so. I think we all need to go home and watch some Detective Chimp. So I think all that's left is to say thank you for listening. Please do remember to follow us on all the usual following things, podcast platforms.
Thank you for listening as always, and thank you for all your nice comments and emails.
Yeah, it's always good to hear from you. But with that, I think, shall we leave them with the clue for the next episode?
This is the BBC Home and Forces programmes. Here is the news.
Mass observers wanted to know what ordinary experience was like for people. Not the experience in the newspapers, not what politicians said it was, but what ordinary people said that life was like.